A broke waitress gave her last meal to a stranger. Unexpectedly, he'd show up as a millionaire, change her life forever. The neon sign outside Rosie's diner flickered against the dark, rain-soaked night, casting a faint red glow onto the wet pavement. The diner sat on the side of a nearly deserted highway, its large front windows fogged up from the warmth inside clashing with the cold, damp air outside. Inside, the place was nearly empty. A trucker sat hunched over his coffee in the far booth, his eyes drooping from exhaustion. The radio hummed softly in the background, playing an old country song that no one was really listening to. Behind the counter, Grace Turner wiped down the last of the coffee cups, her arms aching from a long shift. The smell of bacon grease and stale coffee clung to her uniform, and her feet throbbed from standing for hours. She checked the clock above the register, just another hour until closing. Then, the bell above the door jingled. A gust of cold air rushed in as a man stepped inside, rain dripping from his soaked clothes onto the scuffed linoleum floor. He stood just past the threshold, motionless, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. His hair was damp and disheveled, his stubble thick, his coat ripped at the sleeve and covered in dirt. Grace instinctively tensed. Strangers coming in this late were rare, and ones who looked this desperate were even rarer. But something about the man's eyes, tired, hollow, but not threatening, made her pause. He hesitated, glancing around the near-empty diner before slowly walking toward the counter. His steps were unsteady, as if every movement took effort. When he finally reached the stool in front of her, he let out a breath, then spoke. I don't have any money," he said, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "But he swallowed hard. "I could pay you back later. I just need something to eat." Grace's fingers tightened around the towel in her hands. She knew desperation when she saw it. The man wasn't just hungry, he was starving. His clothes clung to him, soaked through from the rain, and up close she could see how pale his skin was beneath the layer of grime. Her stomach twisted. She glanced toward the kitchen window. The last plate of food for the night sat under the heat lamp, her dinner. She had been saving it, planning to eat once her shift ended before heading home to the tiny, cold apartment she could barely afford. But as she looked back at the man in front of her, his eyes darting toward the plate like a caged animal spotting freedom, she knew she couldn't just ignore him. Without a word, she grabbed the plate and placed it in front of him. He froze. His eyes flicked up to hers. "Eat," she said simply. For a moment, he didn't move, as if afraid the offer wasn't real. Then, with shaking hands, he picked up the fork. The first bite was cautious, almost hesitant, but the second came faster. And then, as if his body had finally given in to the hunger, he devoured the food, barely pausing to breathe. Grace stood there, watching, a quiet sadness settling in her chest. She had seen people struggle before, seen them count their last few dollars, trying to make it stretch for one more meal. But this was different. Turing? This man wasn't just down on his luck. He looked like he had been running from something. Or maybe from himself. The trucker in the back threw a few bills onto the table and left without a word, the bell jingling softly behind him. Now, it was just her and the stranger. When he finally slowed down, setting his fork down as if realizing how quickly he had eaten, he looked up at her again. His eyes were different now, softer, but still guarded. "I don't know how to thank you," he murmured. Grace gave a small shrug. "You don't have to." A faint crease formed between his brows, as if her answer confused him. No one's done something like this for me in a long time," he admitted, his voice almost ashamed. She smiled, just a little. "Well, maybe someone should have." A long silence stretched between them. The storm outside raged on, rain pattering against the windows, wind howling through the trees. Then, finally, the man pushed himself up from the stool, wincing slightly as if every muscle in his body ached. He pulled his tattered coat tighter around himself and took one last look at her. "Thank you," he said quietly. Grace just nodded. "Take care of yourself." He hesitated at the door, fingers lingering on the handle. Then, just before stepping back out into the storm, he glanced over his shoulder and said one last thing. "I won't forget this." And then he was gone. Grace stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where he had been. She had no idea who he was, and she never expected to see him again. But something about the way he had said those words made her wonder. The fluorescent light in Grace's apartment flickered, casting eerie shadows on the cracked walls. The place was small, barely big enough for a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a bedroom that doubled as a living room. The heating barely worked, and the scent of dampness clung to the old carpet, no matter how many times she left the window open to air it out. She dropped her bag onto the tiny, scratched-up table, rubbing her temples as exhaustion settled deep into her bones. Another double shift. Another day scraping by. She opened her wallet, pulling out the last few crumpled bills, $12. That was all she had left. With a heavy sigh, she turned toward the kitchenette and grabbed a small pill bottle from the counter. Giving it a light shake, she counted the remaining pills through the translucent plastic. Only 4 left. She bit her lip. Her mother needed these every day, but at the cost of $20 per refill, she had been stretching them as far as she could, cutting doses in half, skipping days when her mother seemed strong enough. It wasn't enough. The couch in the corner of the room creaked as her mother, Carol, stirred under a thin blanket. Her breathing was steady, but her face was pale, her once bright eyes dulled by fatigue. Grace knelt beside her, brushing a strand of gray hair from her forehead. "How are you feeling?" Carol gave her a tired smile. "I've been worse." Grace forced a chuckle, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. That's not very reassuring. Carol's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "You work too hard, sweetheart." Grace swallowed the lump in her throat. "I have to." Carol sighed, knowing there was no point in arguing. For a few minutes, Grace just sat there, listening to the soft rhythm of her mother's breathing, trying to ignore the crushing weight of their reality. Then, a loud knock shattered the silence. Her stomach dropped. Slowly, she stood and walked toward the door, already knowing who it was. When she opened it, she was met with the familiar scowl of her landlord, Mr. Collins. "Grace," he said, voice flat. "Rent was due 4 days ago." She tightened her grip on the doorknob. "I know. I just need a little more time." Collins let out a long sigh, rubbing his forehead. "I've been patient, but I've got bills to pay too. If you don't have it by the end of the week, I'll have to ask you to leave." Grace's chest tightened. "Please, just a few more days." "No more extensions," he said, his tone final. "I'm sorry, Grace." And then he was gone. She stood frozen in the doorway, her mind racing. She had no savings, no backup plan, and nowhere else to go. Slowly she closed the door, leaning her forehead against the cold wood as the weight of it all pressed down on her. She had given away her last meal the night before, and yet she didn't regret it. Even with the threat of eviction hanging over her head, she knew she would have made the same choice again. But as she sat down on the worn-out couch beside her sleeping mother, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth, a single question echoed in her mind. Will things ever get better? The bell above the door jingled as the morning shift started at Rosie's diner. The scent of coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, but Grace barely noticed. She was running on autopilot, pouring coffee, taking orders, wiping down counters. It had been a week since that night. A week since she had given away her last meal to a stranger who had vanished into the rain. And in that week, nothing had changed. Her rent was still overdue. Her mother's pills were running out, and she was still stuck in the same cycle, working shifts that barely covered the bills, let alone her dreams of a better life. She had almost convinced herself that night didn't matter. That the man, whoever he was just another lost soul passing through. Then, the mail arrived. Grace. Betty, the diner's owner, waved a thick envelope in the air. "This came for you." Grace frowned, drying her hands on her apron before taking it. She rarely got mail, certainly not in an envelope this nice. The paper was thick, the handwriting on the front neat and precise. No return address. Her stomach tightened. She slid a finger under the seal and pulled out its contents. A single plane ticket. One way, Boys to Los Angeles. And a note. "I told you I wouldn't forget. Come to this address, R." Grace's heart pounded. R. There was only one person it could be. Her eyes darted to the ticket again, scanning the date. Tomorrow. She let out a shaky breath, her mind racing. Why would he send this? And more importantly, should she go? She knew nothing about him, not even his full name. For all she knew, this could be a joke. Or worse, a scam. But then, she thought about her mother, about the stack of unpaid bills sitting on her kitchen counter. About the fact that, for the first time in her life, someone had noticed her, had chosen her. What did she really have to lose? That night, after her shift ended, she packed a small bag. The next morning she boarded the plane. As she buckled her seatbelt, staring out at the endless sky stretching before her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into something she could never turn back from. And for the first time in a long time. That didn't scare her. It gave her hope. The cab pulled up in front of an iron gate, the golden letters Hale Estate glistening under the California sun. Grace's breath caught as she peered past the towering fence, her eyes widening at the sight before her. A sprawling white mansion sat on a hill, its sleek glass windows reflecting the endless blue sky. A perfectly manicured garden stretched out in front, and beyond it, an infinity pool overlooked the city skyline. It was a level of wealth she had only seen in movies, far removed from the dimly lit diners and crumbling apartments of Idaho. Her grip tightened around the strap of her worn-out bag. This had to be a mistake. She reached into her pocket, fingers brushing against the note that had led her here. "I told you I wouldn't forget. Come to this address. R. R. R." Her heartbeat quickened. Could it really be him? The gate buzzed, breaking her thoughts, and slowly swung open. The driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "You sure about this, miss?" Grace swallowed hard. "No." Still, she stepped out of the car. The moment she reached the front entrance, the massive oak doors swung open. A sharply dressed man in his 60s greeted her with a polite nod. "Miss Turner," he said. "Mr. Hale is expecting you." "Mr. Hale?" Before she could ask any questions, he turned on his heel, leading her through the grand foyer. Grace barely had time to take in the marble floors, the towering chandelier, or the expensive art lining the walls before they reached a sunlit sitting room. And there he was, the man from the diner. Only he wasn't the same. Gone were the rain-soaked clothes, the hollow cheeks, the desperate look in his eyes. Now he sat comfortably on a sleek leather couch, dressed in a fitted navy blue shirt and slacks, his dark hair neatly styled. Richard Hale. Oh, the name hit her like a freight train. Everyone in the business world knew that name. Hale Tech, one of the fastest growing investment firms in California. And the man who had once begged for a meal in her diner was its founder. Her pulse thundered as she stood frozen in the doorway. Richard rose to his feet, offering a small, almost sheepish smile. "Grace." Her mouth went dry. "You," she shook her head. "What the hell is going on?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I owe you an explanation." She crossed her arms. "Yeah, you do!" He gestured toward the couch. "Please, sit." She hesitated but finally sank into the plush leather. Richard sat across from her, elbows resting on his knees. That night at the diner, he began, "I wasn't lying. I really didn't have any money on me." His lips pressed together. "But what I didn't tell you was that it wasn't always like that." Grace narrowed her eyes. "Go on." He exhaled. "Before Hale Tech, before all of this, I was homeless." She blinked. "What?" He nodded. "It was years ago. I lost everything, my job, my savings, my home. I slept on benches, begged for food, did whatever I had to do to survive." His jaw tightened. "I know what it's like to be at rock bottom." Grace's breath hitched. "I got lucky," Richard continued. "Someone took a chance on me, gave me an opportunity when no one else would, and eventually I built this company from the ground up." She stared at him, still struggling to connect the man in front of her with the one she had met that night. "But when I walked into your diner that night," he said softly, "I felt it again. That hunger, that desperation. And then you did something no one else would have done." She swallowed. "I just gave you food." His gaze locked onto hers. "You gave me kindness." Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, he leaned forward. "I want to do the same for you." Grace's chest tightened. "What are you saying?" Richard met her eyes. "I want to help you. Change your life. The same way someone once changed mine." Her hands clenched into fists. This was insane. Completely insane. And yet, a part of her wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that, for once, something good was happening to her. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Because for the first time in a long time, she had no idea what to say. The air inside Hale, Texas headquarters was cool and sterile. A stark contrast to the warm, greasy scent of Rosie's diner that Grace had grown used to. The towering glass windows overlooked the Los Angeles skyline, casting long reflections across the polished marble floors. Grace stood in the middle of it all, feeling completely out of place. It had been a week since she had arrived in California. A week since Richard had made his shocking offer to help her change her life. She had half expected to wake up one morning and realize it had all been a dream. But every time she opened her eyes, she was still in the guest suite of his mansion. And now, she was here. At Hale Tech. Richard had arranged everything. He had given her a position as an assistant in the company's business development department. Not a handout, he had assured her, but a real opportunity. But as she stood in the sleek, modern office, surrounded by sharply dressed professionals who walked with the confidence of people who belonged here, doubt crept into her chest. What was she doing here? She didn't know the first thing about business, let alone working in a place like this. And judging by the way some of the employees were looking at her, they knew it too. The first few days were brutal. Grace struggled to keep up with the fast-paced environment. The business jargon flew over her head, and she spent every night in her guest room poring over articles, trying to teach herself the basics of the industry. It didn't help that some of her coworkers weren't exactly welcoming. She caught the whispers behind her back. She was a waitress. Richard just gave her a job? Must be nice. She won't last a month. She ignored them, or, at least, she tried to. But one afternoon, as she was carrying a stack of reports through the office, she overheard a conversation that made her stop in her tracks. "She's just a charity case," a woman's voice said, laced with amusement. Grace's stomach twisted. "She probably doesn't even know how to use Excel," another voice snickered. The two women didn't even notice her standing a few feet away, frozen in place. Her face burned with humiliation. She had worked so hard her whole life, scraping by just to survive. And now, even when given an opportunity, she was still less in their eyes. The worst part? A small voice in the back of her mind whispered that maybe they were right. Maybe she didn't belong here. That evening she sat in her office long after everyone else had gone home, staring at the computer screen. The numbers and charts blurred together, frustration bubbling in her chest. She wanted to prove herself. She needed to. But what if she couldn't? Long day? She jumped at the sound of Richard's voice. He was leaning against the doorframe, his sleeves rolled up, looking more like the man she had met in the diner than the billionaire CEO the world knew him as. Grace exhaled, rubbing her temples. "You could say that." He stepped inside, studying her carefully. "You're working late." She let out a humorless laugh. "I'm always working late. I have to, if I want to catch up to everyone else." Richard frowned. "You will catch up." She shook her head. "You don't get it. They know I don't belong here." Her voice wavered. "And I think maybe they're right." Silence stretched between them. Then, Richard walked over and placed a firm hand on the desk. "Look at me, Grace." She did. "You do belong here," he said, his voice steady. "And if anyone in this company thinks otherwise, they can take it up with me." Her breath caught. "Shot. I gave you this job because I know you can do it," he continued. "Not because I felt sorry for you. Not because you needed saving. But because I saw someone who deserved more than what life had given her." Grace swallowed hard, his words hitting her like a tidal wave. "I won't let them push you out," Richard said. "But you have to want this too." She did. She really did. Taking a shaky breath, she met his gaze. "Then I guess I better get back to work." A slow smile spread across Richard's lips. "Atta girl." From that day forward, everything changed. Grace worked harder than ever, not to prove herself to others, but to prove to herself that she was capable. She asked questions, studied business strategies, and slowly, things began to click. She still wasn't perfect. She still had moments of doubt. But when another meeting came around and someone tried to dismiss her input, she didn't shrink back. She spoke up. And for the first time, people listened. Especially Richard. And with every passing day, he realized something. He hadn't just changed her life. She was changing his too. The chandelier above shimmered like a sky full of stars, casting golden light over the grand ballroom. The scent of expensive champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres lingered in the air as elegantly dressed guests laughed and clinked their glasses, their conversations floating like background music. Grace stood near the edge of the room, gripping the stem of her untouched champagne flute. She had never felt more alone. The event was one of Richard's biggest corporate galas of the year, a gathering of the wealthiest investors, CEOs, and industry leaders. He had invited her, insisting that she deserved to be there, that she had earned her place in this world. But as she stood among them, dressed in an expensive gown that didn't feel like hers, listening to conversations about yachts, private islands, and million-dollar deals, she realized something. This wasn't her world. And maybe it never would be. Grace. She turned at the sound of Richard's voice. He was by her side in an instant, looking every bit the powerful businessman in his tailored black suit. His eyes softened the moment they met hers. "You okay?" he asked, voice low enough that only she could hear. She forced a smile. "Yeah, just taking it all in." Richard studied her carefully. "You sure?" "No." But she nodded anyway. A waiter passed by, and Richard grabbed a glass of champagne, handing it to her. "I know these things can be overwhelming," he admitted. "But you belong here." Grace let out a quiet breath, looking around the room. "Do I?" Richard frowned. "Of course you do." She glanced down at her champagne flute, her fingers tightening around the glass. "These people," she murmured, "they don't live in the same world I came from." She exhaled slowly. "And I don't think I ever will." Silence hung between them. Then, before Richard could say anything, another guest approached, a tall man in his 50s, wearing a smug smile. "Richard, there you are." The man clapped him on the shoulder before turning to Grace, his eyes scanning her with thinly veiled curiosity. "And who is this lovely young woman?" Richard straightened. "This is Grace Turner. She's been working with me at Hale Tech." The man's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Ah, one of your new recruits?" Before Grace could answer, he let out a small chuckle. "Well, you must be quite the lucky one. Not many people get a personal invitation into this world." The implication was clear. Grace forced a tight-lipped smile, murmuring something polite before excusing herself. She needed air. "Aye." She stepped out onto the balcony, the cool night breeze a welcome relief from the suffocating weight pressing on her chest. Her hands gripped the railing as she stared down at the glittering city below. Richard had given her everything: opportunity, security, a chance at a new life. So why did she still feel like she didn't belong? Why did she still feel like the girl from Idaho, struggling to make ends meet in a world that had already decided her worth? And the answer hit her like a freight train. Because she was still that girl. She hadn't changed. She had just been placed in a setting that never truly fit her. And no matter how much she loved what she had built at Hale Tech, no matter how much she cared about him, she couldn't stay. Not if it meant losing herself. Richard found her moments later. "I knew something was wrong," he said, stepping beside her. Grace swallowed hard, her throat tight. "Richard." He turned to her, brows knitting together at the sound of her voice. "What is it?" She hesitated, searching his face. She didn't want to hurt him, but she had to tell the truth. "I can't do this," she whispered. Richard's expression darkened. "What do you mean?" She forced herself to meet his gaze. "This life, this world, it's not mine." His jaw clenched. "Grace, you don't have to prove anything to them." "It's not about them," she said. "It's about me." She inhaled shakily. "I thought I wanted this. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, if I just tried hard enough, I could make this my home." She shook her head, blinking back tears. "But it's not. And it never will be." Richard was silent for a long time. Then, finally, he exhaled. "You're leaving." She nodded, her heart aching. He looked away, his hands resting on the railing as he stared out at the city. "I don't want you to go." Her chest tightened. "I know." He turned back to her, something raw and vulnerable in his gaze. "But you have to." She nodded again, this time with tears slipping down her cheeks. He swallowed hard before finally saying, "Then I won't stop you." And those words, those 4 simple words, broke her more than anything else ever had. The next morning she packed her bags. As she stepped into the car that would take her to the airport, she glanced back one last time. Richard stood at the entrance of his estate, hands in his pockets, watching her leave. She gave him a small, sad smile. And then, with a heavy heart, she turned away. Because she had made her choice. And now she had to live with it. The bell above the door jingled as Grace wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time that morning. The scent of frying bacon and cheap coffee filled the air, the same as it always had. Everything looked the same, felt the same. But she wasn't the same. It had been a month since she left California. A month since she walked away from Hale Tech, from the world she never felt like she belonged to. A month since she walked away from him. And every day since, she had told herself she had made the right choice. But if that were true, why did she feel so empty? "Grace, you okay?" She blinked, snapping out of her thoughts as Betty, the diner's owner, peered at her with concern. "Yeah," Grace said quickly, forcing a smile. just tired. Betty didn't look convinced, but she didn't press further. Grace turned back to her work, trying to focus on anything other than the ache in her chest. She should be relieved to be back in Idaho. Life was simple again, predictable. She could take care of her mother, pay her rent, and not worry about trying to fit into a world that had never been hers. And yet, she missed it. Not the wealth, not the corporate world. Him. She missed the way Richard looked at her like she mattered. She missed the conversations, the way he challenged her, the way he believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. And no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, the truth was clear. She hadn't just left a job. She had left the one person who made her feel alive. The door chimed again. Grace sighed, grabbing a menu, barely looking up. "Welcome to Rosie's Diner. Sit anywhere you like." And she froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Richard Hale stood in the doorway. But he wasn't in a suit. He wasn't the billionaire CEO of Hale Tech. He was just Richard. Jeans, a simple button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up, no Rolex, no polished shoes. Just him. Her fingers tightened around the menu as she stared at him, heart hammering. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. Grace swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. "What are you doing here?" Richard exhaled. "Looking for you." She shook her head. "Richard, let me talk," he cut in gently. She closed her mouth. He took a deep breath. "After you left, I tried to go back to my life, to Hale Tech, to everything I built." He let out a small, humorless laugh. "And for a while, I told myself I was fine, that it was better this way." Grace's heart clenched. "But then one day, I woke up and realized something." He met her gaze, his voice quieter now. Softer. "None of it mattered without you." Tears burned at the back of her eyes. "Grace, I don't want a world of boardrooms and luxury, if you're not in it." He stepped closer, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't care where we are. I don't care what we're doing. He swallowed hard. I just want you." Her breath hitched. For weeks she had convinced herself that they belonged in different worlds, that love wasn't enough. But standing here, looking at him, she knew she had been wrong, because love was everything. Richard's hand reached for hers, fingers brushing lightly against her skin. A silent question. A choice. And this time, she wasn't going to run. With a trembling smile, she laced her fingers through his. And just like that, she was home. And so, Grace and Richard proved that sometimes the greatest wealth isn't measured in money, but in the people who stand by our side. What started as a simple act of kindness in a small-town diner turned into a love story that defied expectations, a story of second chances, of finding where you truly belong, and of choosing love over fear. Because in the end, it's not about the life we're given, but the life we choose. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more powerful tales of love, resilience, and the unexpected ways kindness can change lives. Because sometimes, one small act can change everything. And maybe, just maybe, the next story could be yours.